Hello, and welcome to How Green Is Your Deal, a podcast about Europe's path to climate neutrality, the challenges it faces, and the ideas that guide it. I'm your host, Jana Jöns, a climate policy researcher at Stockholm University, and this podcast is part of the GreenDeal-NET network and the EU Climatic Project. Today's episode takes us to Brazil, which hosted COP30 in November this year, to continue our conversation on international climate governance. You probably heard about this COP before, came across it in the news or somewhere else, but you might not exactly know what actually happens there or what was decided and what it all means for our fight against climate change. So in this episode, I thought it would be nice to unpack the structure of international climate governance a little bit, to dig a little bit deeper in these COPs, how these work, why they matter, and what can such multilateral settings still mean in these increasingly turbulent times. So of course, I'm not doing this by myself, but as always, I'm joined by great guests to help us make sense of it all. Today, we are joined by Karin Bäckstrand, a professor at Stockholm University and a leading expert on global climate governance, who has been to this COP and many COPs before. Hi, Karin. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Jana. Great to be here. I really look forward to talk to you and to be at this fantastic pod.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So to begin with, for people that don't really know what these COPs are, or maybe have only superficially related to them on the news, can you first explain us a little bit about what they are, how they work, and maybe also who participates?
Yes. So COPs are basically stands for Conference of Parties, which means that representatives from almost 200 states meets annually to negotiate climate agreements. And we've had COP for more than 30 years, from the Climate Convention to the Kyoto Protocol and Paris Agreement. So one can say COPs are the function, they are decision-making machines to move forward treaties and protocols on climate change and other agreements, of course. So they occur annually. The climate COPs are 2 weeks. The average participants, it can be 30 to 58,000. I think at the COP30 in Belém, in Brazil, I think it was 56,000 participants. Of these, at least a third are non-state actors. The primary, of course, participants who have decision-making and negotiation rights are states. But we've seen an enormous increase of different non-state actors. It can be business, cities, local communities, and we can come back to that. At the Belém COP, it was enormous participation by indigenous communities. But to remember, it's Conference of Parties, states decide, civil society, non-state actors, they have a voice, but not a vote. They can influence, but participate, make statements, interference, but it's the states who decide.
Thank you so much for this introduction to COPs, really as sort of these decision-making bodies for the states, but perhaps also these venues to discuss climate action on all this, with this broad variety of participants that get together and try to make a change in the world. As you mentioned, these COPs are often linked to climate agreements as well. Now for this one, COP30, 10 years after the Paris Agreement, can you tell us a little bit more about what made it this time very significant, or what it means for this international climate governance?
It was, as you say, very significant 10 years after the Paris Agreement. And Belém was framed as the implementation COP, because now we have agreements in place. It's about accelerating implementation so we can decarbonize the world by 2050. It was also called the Truth COP, that we really are at a very critical juncture where we need to also speak truth to power. And I think that's how civil society, non-state actors, and I should also say a lot of media and journalists were there. They have increased in participation. So and I think we are coming to a place now in the climate negotiations and COP where we don't need more text, we don't need more agreements, we need full-scale implementation. And that's why at the Belém COP, which was framed as this implementation COP, it was an enormous meeting space for, I have never been to a COP with so many indigenous communities that were inside and outside the negotiation venue to influence, because their livelihoods in the Amazon, it was the first Amazon COP, is extremely dependent on climate change and what happens and how that impacts biodiversity, deforestation is all interlinked. So it was enormous activism, of course lobbying, trying to influence states. There was a demonstration on the Saturday when I arrived, enormous big, with indigenous people, local communities that tried to fuse their perspectives very into, hopefully, they hoped it would improve the outcome. And then I should also mention youth is a group there. There are actually 8 constituency or 9 constituency groups, so indigenous people, youth, very vocal voice, industry and business, science is one group, the scientific and research community, trade unions, very important if we come into the issue of just transition, and then women and gender. It's also a very strong group. So this group complemented, I could say there are 2 parallel tracks. We have the formal interstate bargaining negotiation, and then we have the second track called the Global Climate Action Agenda, which is, as you say, this meeting place for non-state and state actors.
So its significance is in that way also then twofold, first on this more like intergovernmental track, really trying to think, okay, how can we now implement this Paris Agreement 10 years after we've decided on it? How do we move beyond just putting words on paper or like having these declarations, and how can we really create action? But then also really strong significance on the second track because of this participation of indigenous people and all these other groups that then kind of get together, and maybe also for them to have an opportunity to finally also discuss with people from different parts of the world and to think about how a civil society or how to create strong networks between themselves and take action there. You also mentioned that there were a lot of lobbyists and industry presence. I think most of us have seen also these articles or this report about like very high numbers of lobbyists. I guess that also shows the significance of this COP still, if they feel like they need to be there and influence the conversation as well, or find or think that it's a good venue for them to also be engaged in. If it was really not doing a lot, then maybe they wouldn't have been there all. You also mentioned something about outcomes and discussion points already before. Can you say a little bit more about what were perhaps the main discussion points between those states or within the COP setting, and what actually was decided upon in the end?
Yes, I can talk about the outcome, the Belém outcome. I cannot go into detail because it's 29 decisions. But if I'm going to make a summary of the outcome, I would say I can make the summary, it's 2 steps backwards, but 1 step forward. And I also want to quote Thomas Hale at University of Oxford. He said that COPs are absolutely essential. This COP was absolutely essential, but completely insufficient, because there is a debate on, do we need COPs? And we should abolish them. And of course, because they are not delivering the outcome we hope for and sufficient to tackle climate change. But I agree with Thomas Hale, they are absolutely necessary because, as you said, it's an enormous meeting space for, yes, also lobbyists. There have been more fossil fuel lobbyists presenting, but for civil society. And we should also remember that against the background of authoritarian populism, nationalism, and a shrinking space for civil society in countries and globally, these are a kind of space for that meeting, exchange, networking. I think that's very important to build coalitions. So just to clarify that, still absolutely we can discuss that COPs should be reformed. There is research on that. But it's a very important agora meeting place. Now to the outcome. Why was it 2 steps back? Well, we had from Glasgow meeting 21 during the pandemic, the phase out of fossil fuel. There was back tracking on that. So there was it didn't come into the Belém package, the outcome, because oil producing countries and petrol states blocked that. So that was really a step backward. However, and then there is a voluntary, instead as a response came a voluntary roadmap by 80 countries led by Colombia to call for that. So that process go on, but it's voluntary, soft governance. So that was really many countries and like EU fought for this, but it didn't succeed. Then there was, however, other outcomes that were more in the positive direction. There was a tripling of global funding for climate adaptation, which is very important. Not only mitigation, but how these states, communities from all across need to adapt to the reality of climate change. And there was also, which is also a very important issue, a decision on a mechanism for just transition, how to do a fair energy and climate transition. Very important to address this distributional issues of climate change. So that was forward. And also some more commitments of climate funding and climate finance. So yes, a backlash like we see in many countries, but I would also say that many countries, including the European Union, fought a lot for stronger language on adaptation, finance, and nature-based solutions. And that actually had some success. So I don't want to do this completely dark.
So maybe if we look at it and conclude like what this COP actually was, there might be room for improvements. Also, I guess, as you mentioned before, now that there's sort of a move from like making agreements towards actually implementing the agreements, maybe a sort of different sort of negotiations are necessary for that. Complicated, especially in these times, but in a way a bit hopeful that at least there's this voluntary track, hopefully moving forward. And maybe how sometimes in the EU they're like, maybe we should have an EU at 2 speeds. Maybe there should then also be international climate governance where these coalitions of the willing can keep moving forward. And always positive that there's still at least these discussions on adaptation and climate finance as well, because we're really in a situation now where climate is not a future crisis, even though it's often portrayed like that, but it of course has a lot of impacts. I think also as we saw in the last months in Asia with all the typhoons and hurricanes and everything. So making sure that there's money for countries to actually adapt and make themselves more resilient and have funding to implement green technologies and all of that. Hopeful that at least some steps in the right decisions are being taken rather than no decision at all, I suppose.
Can I add one thing here?
Yes, of course.
That I've omitted. I should say one more and I indicated that in positive thing about this COP. I've been to, I don't want to confess how many COPs I've been to, but I must say this. This is one of the best COPs in terms, not of outcome, because they have been better, but in terms of the host and the hospitality and how the host, Brazil, really worked very hard to include civil society, citizen, non-state actors in the negotiation venue, the city of Belém. And I can say that, and this shows the importance, as you pointed to, COPs also for the country and the local. I talked to many people, many indigenous local people, and all said, because I asked, why should we have a COP in the Amazonas? I mean, isn't it crazy with the circus here? And all said, it's so important that we have it here because it brings the spotlight to our situation and how extremely vulnerable we are to climate change, biodiversity loss. It has also meant an improvement of the infrastructure in the city. So I didn't meet during a whole week. And now I'm not talking to people outside the negotiation space. So I think I want to also compliment Brazil for having a very successful COP and extremely friendly space. The Brazilians are a fantastic people. They are good at festivals and partying too.
That's good to know. And I think that's also an important, or if you do then organize a COP in the Amazon, you also have to do it in this way, right? That indigenous people do feel heard or that they do have a say. And it's not sort of like greenwashing or I don't know what to call it, sort of exercise where you hold it there, but then people are still not included. So it's nice to hear that for at least some of them, it's been a positive experience or they feel that they've gained something from that as well. Suddenly the world is in the Amazon.
Exactly.
It's good to hear. You also mentioned the EU, and I know you worked a lot on like EU leadership and international climate policies of the European Union. I was wondering if you could say something more about how you view the role of the EU. As we've discussed in our previous episodes, the EU is a bit in turbulent times when it comes to climate policy at the moment as well. How do you see that this impacts and its role on the international level?
Well, in general, I have also been following, of course, EU's role in the negotiations, and what was extremely dramatically new here was that, and that is linked to EU, that for the first time in 30 years, US didn't have a delegation there. And I can say that I met many American negotiators who were leading experts. It's extremely frustrating, but that impacts EU too, because EU was, of course, in this with Trump withdrawing and being outright aggressive toward COPs, was isolated, didn't have a joint partner like during the Biden administration with Biden and Kerry, the climate envoy. They really scaled up, for example, climate finance. Now, with this withdrawal, so EU at large, as you say, in this extremely turbulent, rapidly changing geopolitical landscape with the rise of China, and China has been also historically made agreements with US and been working quite pragmatically. They chose to go in coalitions with Saudi Arabia and oil-producing states. So EU really fought to get the language on fossil fuel phase out in the Belém, but didn't succeed. They would have succeeded if US would have been there. So not to blame EU for that. I would still say, having said that, that EU is now operating in a very I should also say EU faces, as you have brought up in this pod, internal conflicts of the pace and ambition and scale of the European Green Deal. And of course, if you as an actor is divided at home, you cannot have the same impact. So both the geopolitical, very turbulent global landscape against the background of authoritarian populism, climate delay, climate rollback, it was hard for the EU. Having said that, I think they helped very much the negotiation of giving more, even if their own NDC was not as ambitious. They really pushed for three things. Much more on climate mitigation. They worked very hard to get climate adaptation forward and succeeded. Thirdly, finance, and I would say fourthly, energy transition. They really, EU pushed to anchor these other issue areas in the Belém outcome. But it was hard to overcome the resistance against this petrostate coalition.
So perhaps, despite the internal turbulence going on and this conflict still being relatively ambitious compared to the other actors that were potentially present, and then sort of perhaps more difficult for the EU to find like an ally or someone to really work together with to get certain ideas inwards, because then of course with this US and the ongoing geopolitical turbulence that we see at the moment, that creates a bit of a difficult position for the EU to really get its view in the final documents or to really weigh strongly on the negotiations as well. Hopefully next year better, I suppose. We'll see what happens in 1 year's time. Maybe to end this episode, do you have anything that gives you hope for the future? It can be related to this international climate governance or also just in general in life. Something that brings you light in these dark times.
Yes, I would say my hope from Belém, and I'm coming back to that because it was very salient there. It is this enormous mobilization from below, from coalitions of civil society. And I should also say, we talked about the problem, or you mentioned this, which should be mentioned, how fossil fuel lobbyists are taking over very much of COP. In Dubai they were and we see them. However, there is another part of business. Business is not a monolithic actor. It's the renewable energy industry. It's small scale, discussions about energy democracy, making new coalitions with indigenous people, non-state actors. So I see that gives me hope, those new progressive coalitions also with states. So that can be an antidote against what we now see in many countries, backlash. Now, so I hope some of that energy can transform because even in a country like US, people see the realities of climate change, the fires in California, the storms. So, and I should also mention that in US the governor of California was there, a lot of cities, a lot of the research. So I hope for this force from below, but we should mention 1 year. Next year it will be in Turkey. But Australia, who wanted to win it, they will be the chair. Double here, I think it's, had it been Turkey, both host and chairing, I would have been seriously worried for reasons you brought up, Jana. Industry, green wash, but a third thing that is very worrisome, and that I should end with positive, but this I'm worried about. having a COP in an authoritarian state doesn't give this space for civil society. However, I think now with the UN has its system of allowing the different constituency groups we talked about, but I'm more concerned about the local in Turkey NGOs, also journalists, because Turkey is the largest prison for journalists. So now I was going to end with some positive. I did with the civil society mobilization, but we should really, as researchers, as civil society, keep a pressure on the keep focusing and not be very keep the eyes on the COP in November next year.
Yes, a lot of willingness and still hope for action, I think, or willingness to take action in like more of these grassroots movements or sub-state actors. I think everyone still wants to fight climate crisis, and we can also still try to make it work, even if the world leaders at the moment might be less engaged with it. There's still something possible from below, but it's like you said, we should make sure that the space for this bottom-up movements still exists and is also present in these COPs, not only international NGOs, but also the local NGOs, and also in Europe itself and everywhere in the world, making sure that civil society and activists have their space and can challenge the policymakers. And in that way, trying to create or still maintain this movement against the climate crisis. I think it's still like a hopeful thing to end on, but
Can
also like a message. Yeah, please.
Can I end with one? I forgot to mention one fantastic thing in COP in Belém, and this is positive, I promise.
Yes, perfect.
I went to, there has now started, we talked about the tracks, the non-state, sub-state, the Global Climate Action Agenda. It's one track with hybrid participation, and then we have the formal negotiation track. In Belém at the side event, and this is research and civil society organizations, it's a proposal, and that has materialized and is being planned, of a citizen track. A citizen track where they engage through various, now during the spring, up in the run-up to Turkey, there will be a number of citizen assemblies across the world in different countries. This idea of putting, not only because non-state actors, business, trade unions, civil society, they represent a legitimate stakeholder interest. But we as citizens in different countries, we need more of citizen and public participation in also the process preceding COP. So that will take off. This initiative with civil society and researchers is taking off during the spring and was launched in Belém. So that gives me also hope, putting citizens at the center of the climate transition.
That is very exciting indeed, and something that hopefully we can talk about next year as well, then at the COP, and see how the citizen assemblies have worked and how they could have contributed to this COP. I look forward to it already. Thanks a lot, Karin, for sharing all of your insights with us today and giving all your information about the COPs. It was really nice to have you on.
Thank you so much, Jonna, for inviting me. I'm so happy to be to my first participation in this COP. I really look forward to it. It's great.
First, but hopefully not last. Yes. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to How Green Is Your Deal on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you are listening. If you want to stay informed on GreenDeal-NET's activities, please go to greendeal.net.eu and subscribe to the newsletter.